For the last few weeks, we've been doing a study through the book of Esther, working our way bit by bit through this very powerful story and some of the great people of faith that it involves. We got started by looking at the excesses of King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, this Persian king, whose excesses ended up leading to Queen Vashti making a refusal to one of his requests and ultimately being sort of dethroned and demoted from her position. Following this, we talked about an exploitative contest that led to the young Jewish girl Esther becoming the new queen, rising to prominence, receiving a banquet of her own as she was given the crown. Last week, we talked about the threat from a man named Haman, the Agagite, who was enraged by Mordecai's unwillingness to show him the kind of respect that would inflate his ego the way that he wanted it to. And so he had these murderous intentions towards the Jews. Because of his high-ranking position, he succeeded in convincing the king to allow him full extermination of these people. An announcement was sent out to all the kingdom just the day before Passover was to begin to let everyone know that on the appointed day, the military would be making a uniform strike against the Jews to wipe them off the face of the earth. That's where the story picks up today. If you have a Bible with you, I would invite you to turn to Esther chapter 4. That's where we're going to be spending all of our time this morning. Esther chapter 4, it begins with the sound of clothing being torn. It's the sound of clothing being torn, and specifically, it's Mordecai's clothing. This is Esther's close relative who's been raising her like a father, who's taken care of her. He is tearing his clothing, and you do this as a sign of mourning in many ancient cultures. When you've received some of the worst news of your life, you would tear your clothing in protest of what news you've just heard, in devastation for what you've just learned. And so he's torn his clothing, and he follows this by putting on sackcloth and ashes. These are things reminiscent of the grave. It was a way of kind of putting on yourself the horrors of death and a loss of life. And then he went only as far as the king's gate in the city, because to be mourning and wearing sackcloth was something that just wasn't allowed in the inner parts of the city. So the king's gate is as far as he was allowed to go. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, the king's gate there in Susa, it was a place where people went to wail as victims of injustice, especially when they were hoping that the king would notice and take up their cause. So the king's gate is where you would go to mourn publicly, to try and draw the king's attention, to invite him to help you in your misfortune and your situation. Of course, the terrible thing about this situation is that it's by the king's very own orders that the Jews are about to experience such a horrific injustice. Under Haman's influence, the king himself is the one who has issued the order that Mordecai is now lamenting. And so chapter 4 begins with the sound of clothing being torn, and it's followed by the sound of wailing, bitter screaming, crying. It's coming from Haman, but it's also coming from many people around the city and ultimately throughout the kingdom, as all the Jews have learned the date of their execution. Collectively, they're crying out, they're wailing, they're lamenting, they're exasperated over what it is they could possibly do. In every province, people are mourning at this horrific news that's gone out. So, we don't know exactly what news Esther's servants told her. We think most likely what she's been told is that, hey, your relative Mordecai has torn his clothes, he's wearing sackcloth and ashes, and he's over there at the king's gate screaming and wailing and carrying on. And it says that she's overcome with fear. For Mordecai to be so shaken, what in the world could it be? And so she's fearful, she's trembling, she herself is terrified, and she doesn't even know exactly what it is that should be terrifying her. One thing that's interesting to me is that this chapter is one of the most significant in the whole story. And often we kind of depict these events unfolding as like Mordecai and Esther getting together and having a conversation. But the truth is, in this scenario, they're only communicating by messengers. And so she sends some messengers to Mordecai to say, what in the world is going on? Why are you doing this? Everything in this exchange is carried via messengers. And so she sends some better clothing to Mordecai and says, take off that sackcloth, wipe off those ashes, dress yourself properly, stop acting like this. Why are you so upset? What's the problem? He refuses to do that, of course. And so Esther sent one of the king's eunuchs to find out what Mordecai was doing and why. That's the reason. What is he doing and why is he doing it? I think that's insightful for us because it shows us just how insulated she is in palace life from the word on the street and what people are actually dealing with. Just the privilege of living in the royal household. Like, she knows he's upset. She has no clue why. She's insulated completely from what's actually happening in the world. So she sends this eunuch to ask Mordecai why he's doing this. And Mordecai responds by providing all the relevant details. This is what happened. This is what Haman is up to. This is what he's trying to accomplish. This is the amount of money that he's personally donating to the royal treasury to fund the military for our execution. He gave her all the details. It says in verse 8, Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king and to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. As we work our way through this chapter, you're going to notice a change in Esther. I want you to notice that at this point, she's still being portrayed largely as this obedient young woman that she has been to her uncle or whatever figure he is, Mordecai. Mordecai is the one who commands Esther, and she receives it the way that you would expect someone to, still kind of deferring to him. She's still kind of acting like the young woman under his care at this point. And so Mordecai has raised this complaint, has told her, commanded her that she has got to go to the king on behalf of her people to beg for mercy and beg for favor. But then Esther sends another messenger back to Mordecai to let him know what he's asking is not feasible and it's incredibly dangerous. There's at least a couple of different reasons why his request is a big problem. The first of these is there's a law. There's a law that if the king has not summoned you, if you don't have a legitimate means by which you are approaching the king to speak to him, he's got this really large golden scepter, and if you enter into his presence, if he extends the scepter to you, it means you get to live. But if he doesn't extend the scepter, it's immediately a death sentence. No one approaches the king if he hasn't summoned you. And so for one, she's saying there's this huge law that applies to everyone, that you don't just get to walk up to King Xerxes and talk to him at your own initiative. You have to receive an invitation to do something like that. Secondly, another reason this is a concerning prospect is that she notes her influence with the king has been kind of dying down. You know, he was all excited when she won the contest to take her as his wife, and she has the crown, but you may remember the passage we looked at last week. He's already on round 2 of gathering the young virgins. He's already kind of chasing after new prospects, and she says, the deal is, he hasn't called for me in it's been a month at this point. It's been a month that the king hasn't called for me. And when you're the queen of Persia, the way that this works is you don't necessarily see the king all that often. You had separate living quarters. You didn't share a bed with him every night. You didn't get to eat with him at meals. It was really only when he felt like seeing you that you would see the king, even as the queen. And so it wasn't a great thing, she says, that he hasn't called me in so long. And then something that she doesn't mention that we can kind of read between the lines in this story. Let's think about what happened to the last queen who got a little bit too uppity with the king, right? He tells Vashti what he wants her to do. She doesn't comply and she's out. What's he going to do to Esther if she breaks that same precedent and comes barging in and he doesn't receive it well? This could go very badly. For Esther to take this step in approaching the king means very literal danger to her life if she does it. Now, some people raise what I think is a very legitimate question here. Why doesn't Esther just work through the proper channels to approach the king? Because it's got to be the case, of course, that sometimes people need to be able to communicate with a king. So there are legitimate channels you could go through and say, may I please get an audience with the king? And then the king could put you, I guess, in the line for when you're going to get to speak to him, if he wants to speak to you. But there are, of course, proper channels through which you could do this. So as the queen, certainly she must know those channels. Why would she not operate through those channels? We don't know exactly why that is. It might just be because of the urgency of the situation, that she knows the line would be so long that maybe it just wouldn't be feasible to wait so long to address the problem. I think a more likely prospect, it has to do with Haman himself. We don't know exactly the title that he's been given within the kingdom, but we know he's extremely high ranking, just barely under the king himself. And one of these positions we're aware of in ancient Persia, we think may have been his position. And if he was in this position, it would mean that nobody gets to have audience with the king unless they go through Haman. And so you can imagine if he had any suspicion at all what she might be trying to do to undermine this, or her connection to Mordecai, you can just imagine how he could certainly interfere and postpone it indefinitely. We don't know that's exactly the case, but for whatever reason, she thinks that it's not going to work to move through typical channels. If she's going to see him at all, she's going to have to be very bold, because this situation can't wait. And so she's communicated, again, through a messenger back to Mordecai and said, there's great danger involved. There's a law that I'd be breaking. And also, he hadn't called me in a month anyways. We're not doing great right now. So the messenger went back to Mordecai, reported everything that Esther said. There's this really good chance I could die if I do what you're suggesting. And in verse 13, this is a great passage. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" For such a time as this. There's two main thrusts in his response to her. Number one, just because you're wearing a crown, it doesn't mean you're going to escape the danger. You don't get an option in this whole scenario that's not a dangerous option. Any road you look at, death could be waiting at the end of it for you, because you're still Jewish, whether you're wearing the crown or not. So don't think you're going to escape danger just because of where you're living right now. But I love this other part too. He says, even if you don't step up, salvation for the Jews will arise from somewhere. It's a great statement of faith, isn't it? There will be salvation from somewhere. Implied, God is going to do something. So, you have the option of pulling back, but something is going to happen. And if you choose not to be part of this scenario and do what you can, it's already guaranteed that you and your household, your family, is all going to perish anyway. So there's that powerful line. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Sometimes you get those moments in life where you maybe get glimpses of clarity. Why am I here? What is it that God has called me to do? Why is it that I'm in this place in this time? In her case, they're asking the question, why is it? Why is it, of all the people that could have been chosen, why was she so favored as to get to become the queen? Why is it that you're a person of such charm and charisma and these skills, these political skills that you have, all the attributes that make you who you are, Esther? Why is it someone who has these attributes just happens to be of our ancestry and our faith, and in this exact moment happens to be there in the palace with the king in your position? Maybe there's something bigger going on here. You may remember that as Haman was trying to determine a significant date, there was the casting of lots to determine his actions. Now, in Esther's case, we don't see her casting lots, but isn't it the case that the decision she's about to make really was a flip of the coin? We don't know at this point in the story how it's going to turn out. Sometimes it's hard when a story's familiar to suspend our knowledge of the future and not really live in the present moment. But this is a very tense moment in the story, because it could go so badly. It could turn out so wrong for her. Everything could be undone. Everything could proceed the way that Haman wanted it to. How is this going to go? Is the king going to receive her warmly? Is he going to extend his scepter? We don't know. We don't know what's about to happen. We don't know how it's going to go. So I appreciate what Mordecai has done here. He's told her, you're wasting your time if you go through life only ever just trying to be safe, because life is dangerous, and if you're trying to be part of the kingdom of God and the people of God, it means to be under threat, to have an enemy, to face danger. You're wasting your time if the only way you try to make it through life is just keeping everything safe all the time. You can't just always chase after safety. He said, really, the choice that's before you is not whether or not you'll be in danger. The choice that's before you is whether or not you're going to summon yourself at this time and at this place to attempt the good you might be capable of doing. Again, the option's not between safety and danger. Both options are danger. The question is, are you going to be a person who lives based on your faith, who steps up and does what you can from where you're standing, or are you just going to hold back and become this anonymous part of the bigger story? Because again, make no mistake, salvation's going to come from somewhere. This isn't going to be the end of us. Something's going to happen. The question is whether or not you're going to be part of it. This is where I want you to notice here in chapter 4, we see a shift in Esther. Remember, up until this point, it talks about how she still kind of does whatever Mordecai tells her to do, and he's commanded her, you need to go and do this. And she's been that way. But this is the part in the story where I think what you see is Esther goes from being someone who's really just wearing a crown to someone who is owning that crown. She starts to see her position and her opportunities, and she really steps into this situation in a way that uniquely she could. It says in verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. We've just shifted on who's giving the orders around here. We see a shift in Esther, but that's her response. Okay, if my only option is danger, then I'm going to choose the path that looks like faithfulness. I'm going to choose the path that looks like trusting, maybe somehow against all hope, against all odds, that God is going to show up and help us in some way. So from here on out, Esther's not playing it safe anymore. Esther in this story has now become an active risk taker. She devises a plan, she delivers it to Mordecai, and as she provides her plan, you see her fully expecting that her plan is going to be followed and obeyed. She's calling on her people to fast and to support her and to rally around her. Mordecai gets the order, he jumps into action exactly like she's commanded him. Functionally speaking, at this point, she is now the leader of the Jewish people. It all comes down to her leadership, and she is revealing her loyalties to her people and her faith now in a conspicuous way. Again, putting herself in danger. But at this point, she's not interested in putting herself first. She's interested in putting God first and the people of God first. And you got to admire that line, if I perish, I perish. She'll accept the consequences of her choices. It's important to understand when we look at Esther's story that courage and faith are actually compatible with fear and hesitation. Have you ever considered that? Sometimes I believe we're too hard on ourselves. When you're trying to do the right thing and you kind of either hesitate at it because you're a little afraid, or it takes a while to get up the courage to have the conversation you needed to have, or to take the course of action that you needed to take, it's easy to pull back a little bit or hesitate at first and then kind of shame yourself for being hesitant. But when you look at Esther's story, those things go hand in hand. She's courageous and she's faithful, but even as she does it, she's certainly fearful and a bit hesitant. Those two things can actually dwell together. It's okay sometimes when you're trying to do the right thing to experience some butterflies in your stomach and some inner turmoil, but what matters is that ultimately our actions look like we're putting our faith in God. That we do take the step forward, that we do the courageous and brave thing, even if we don't feel that brave or that courageous. Because after all, where there is never fear or hesitation, how could there ever really be courage or faith? If you never had to do anything that made you afraid, if you never had to do anything that was hard for you, why would you really need courage? Why would you need faith if you already knew the outcomes? Faith and courage can grow there in fear and hesitation. Hardship gives us opportunities to expand our faith, to grow in our trust of God, to overcome our fears, to learn to really trust that God is going to carry us through, just the way that Mordecai could already state. I don't know what's about to happen, but we're somehow going to get through this. To have that level of faith in God. Esther is fearful. She was trembling when she got the news that Mordecai is out there lamenting and covered in sackcloth and ashes. She's hesitant. But even as she feels those things, she's taking the next trusting step in God's ability to help her. She takes the step of faith regardless of what her emotional state was. And we all know God is the one who blesses that effort. In Esther's story, there's a lot of interesting things going on behind the scenes. You know, there's a lot of things we could point out that don't get mentioned directly in the book of Esther. For example, as we work our way through this book of the Bible, you don't find the word God, you don't find the word Israel, you don't find the word covenant, you don't actually even find the word prayer. None of these words occur in the book of Esther. The closest that we get to any of that is when she calls on her fellow Jews to fast on her behalf. Now, I think we can quite safely make the assumptions why they were fasting and that they would be praying as they fasted, because after all, that's what you do when you fast. You pull back and say, the spiritual needs of my life are so significant right now that I'm going to not worry about any of my physical needs, because the spiritual is the thing that's got to come first. You know, fasting is a deeply spiritual action, but again, there are so many things that don't get mentioned in this book, yet as you watch the story unfold, undeniably, God is still honoring his covenant, remembering Israel, hearing the prayers of his people, taking action. Maybe not in as conspicuous a way as we see in some of the other books of the Bible, but he's still very much at work. Getting a glimpse here in Esther of palace life is a good warning to us. You know, we're in one of the most affluent nations in the world, in one of the most affluent parts of our state. We're comfortable people. We're very comfortable people. And we see in Esther's story the danger of being too comfortable, when you can always pretty much have everything you want the way that you want it, when you want it. Look at what palace life was like. In fact, I don't know if you noticed this, but as we got to the end of chapter 3 last week, after Haman and the king issue this terrible, terrible genocide command, you know what they did? They sat down to drink, not even affected by it, not even appreciating the gravity of what had just happened. Look at Esther in this situation. She is so sheltered from what's going on out in the world, she had to get somebody to tell her what was happening. If it hadn't have been Mordecai, maybe she wouldn't have even found out about it if it hadn't been a relative who was making such a scene. But it's easy to get so comfortable in life that we lose touch with what's going on in the world around us and in the lives of the people around us. The city of Susa, meanwhile, while the king and Haman are sitting down to drink it up, the city of Susa, we're told, was thrown into this period of confusion and commotion. Isn't it the case sometimes that you can hear people on TV talking about these political actions and kind of putting the spin on it that they want you to hear, but then when you're the one who's actually got to live with the new policy and are impacted by the new laws or the budgetary changes or whatever these decisions are that get made, when you're the one who has to face the consequences of what those people in power are doing, you experience these things quite differently. We're told that in Susa, everyone is bewildered by what's happened. I mean, certainly including the Jews who've just gotten a death sentence, but wouldn't you imagine if you were just a citizen, just a Persian citizen living in Susa, and you knew the nice Jewish family next door, and all of a sudden the news comes out and you're thinking about them? You know, our kids have played together, we know that family, we know those people, and all of a sudden they're gonna get wiped off the face of the earth just because of their ethnicity? This is a horror. This is a horror. Yet in palace life, in comfortable life, it's easy to be insulated from the hard things in the world. I wanted us to especially dwell today on Mordecai. There's a lot of different great figures in this story, but I think Mordecai is an especially incredible person in this story. Now, by the end of Esther's book, he's going to be second in command behind King Xerxes only. He's going to be referred to as someone great among the Jews and popular in the multitude of his people. We're told he's a very significant person, dearly loved, treasured, honored. We're told he was the kind of person who sought the welfare of his people and he spoke peace to them. That's how he's described. He sought their welfare and he spoke peace to them. Isn't it interesting, though, that as significant as he is in this story, the book isn't titled Esther and Mordecai, right? She's given first billing, but you can't tell the story of Esther apart from Mordecai's faithfulness and courage in the way that he pushed her along to do the things that she needed to do. I think this is somewhat typical of Mordecai because he is the kind of guy who is content to be behind the scenes, not seeking credit, not seeking glory, just trying to make sure he's doing the right thing and helping things along. That's the typical kind of leadership that we see from him. I don't think he'd have enough hubris to write a book about leadership, right? He's not that kind of a guru. He's just a guy who's doing the right thing. I think Mordecai demonstrates for us really the heart of a servant. He demonstrates what good leadership ought to look like. It was not about self-assertion. It was not about kind of stroking his ego. Leadership for him was about sincerely trying to be a person of God and doing whatever naturally flowed from that. He was just trying to be a person of God and to do whatever naturally flowed from that pursuit. I think that's a worthy goal for all of us. We don't need to seek credit. We're not doing things for our attention or our glory. We're trying to bring Christ glory. But if I'm always asking the question, I'm trying to be a sincere follower of God, and if I'm going to take that seriously in my life, what's the next thing I probably ought to do? That's a really good way to live your life. And in fact, if you act that way over a period of time, it's likely that people probably will notice it and might just follow in your footsteps. But he's someone who simply chose to make his identity be, he wanted to be a person of God, and his actions are never self-seeking. He's just trying to be the kind of person he thought God wanted him to be. And as he does that, look at some of what happens. He's the one who actually saved King Xerxes' life. He uncovered a plot. He turned it in, just doing the decent human being thing to do. The ways that he encouraged Esther, the way that he took her on like a daughter after she had been orphaned. There's so many good things he did humbly, quietly, behind the scenes. We're reminded as we look at Mordecai, because I do think he's a great example of a servant-hearted leader. Being a servant is often not appealing. Being a servant might mean the loss of freedom. Being a servant might mean getting kind of tied down to something that's an obligation. Being a servant might mean economic restrictions. It might mean receiving a demeaned status, not achieving some level of earthly accolades that you might be otherwise desiring. It's not easy to be a servant, but ultimately it's a much better path to be a servant. Now we can point out the way that God's name isn't specifically mentioned here in the book of Esther, but wouldn't you say it's the case that there are some ways that God is especially present throughout the story, if no other ways, in the assumptions of Mordecai? Some of the assumptions he makes about the world and about God and about the way that things are going to be. In his speech to Esther, he has no idea how God was going to use his faith or his servitude. All the things that he's doing, he has no idea what God's going to do with it. We've got other great stories in the Old Testament. You know, sometime maybe we'll study through the story of Israel and the Exodus and Moses, but Moses often showed up knowing what was about to happen. You know, I've got this special staff and God's already told me if I do this, then this is going to happen. And he knew specific signs and wonders he was going to perform. Esther's book isn't a book of signs and wonders. You know, we don't have staffs turning into serpents. We don't have the parting of the Red Sea. We don't have anything that looks particularly miraculous. But I think for that reason, Esther's story should be one that inspires us a lot because Esther's situation is much like ours. This is a story of people who are just trying to follow God, who are looking at the opportunities in front of them, trusting that when they give God their best, God might decide to use some of it. We see that God is at work in human conversation. God is at work in human decision making. When all of these things are done from a place of faith, when we commit our actions to God, God is able to use those things. Esther is an incredibly powerful story of God at work among his people. But again, not with booming thunder from the heavens, in the subtle ways of conversations between family members, between friends, of people sticking together, praying for each other, fasting on behalf of each other. God is the major player in all of this. And what was their responsibility? I think it's the same as our responsibility. To try our best to be people of God, to do the good we're capable of doing, to be prayerful, to be watchful, to be faithful in the simple ways as best we can, knowing that God can weave all of these things together for good in ways that go far beyond anything we ourselves were capable of. I invite each of us this morning to take a look at yourself. Right now, in your life, in the situations where you have influence and connection, what might be the ways that God is calling on you to take a next step? What is the situation you're connected to where we could also say, who knows that maybe you've come into this for such a time as this because of your background and the things you already know and experience and the things that you're capable of and gifted at. Who knows, but maybe this is why you're in this place and this time. Esther reminds us that God works through ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. Would you pray with me? God, we just ask for courage. We ask for clarity. We pray that in all things you give us wisdom, because it is our desire, Lord, that we would be your people, that we would be faithful, that we would be instruments of your peace, that we would be vessels who carry the gospel. Imperfect as we are, Lord, we know, though, that your word is perfect and that you are perfect. We just pray, Lord, that you would be at work in our lives and through our lives, even in the day-to-day interactions that we have. We know that no effort for you, Lord, is too small, because you can use small things and turn them into big things. Lord, just continue to help us and guide us as we move forward. All these things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So this is a time we set aside where if there's some way you need to respond this morning, if there's anything we could pray about, if there's something we could pray over, if there's a commitment to Christ maybe you'd like to make today, if there's anything you'd like to share with us, this is a time you could do that. If you'd like to, you can do that publicly by coming forward while together we stand and sing this song.